It was one of those quiet mornings where everything just feels calm and still. The sun had just started to rise, spreading soft gold light over the trees and the edge of the lake. The water was smooth like a piece of glass, only breaking when a small fish jumped or when the wind gently touched it. For years, the lake had been a place of peace for Daniel. It wasn't just any lake, it was his lake. His grandfather had bought the property decades ago, long before Daniel was born, and left it to him when he passed away. It wasn't big or fancy, but to Daniel it was perfect. It was where he came to think, to breathe, and to get away from the noise of everything else. That morning, he brought his old pickup truck down the dirt path that led to the lake. The road was bumpy and narrow, but Daniel had driven it so many times that he could probably do it with his eyes closed. The back of his truck rattled with fishing gear, a small cooler, and an old folding chair. He parked near the edge of the trees, stepped out, and took in a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, pine trees, water, and the faint scent of damp earth. He smiled to himself. It was going to be a good day. Daniel loved simple things. A quiet morning, a fishing pole, a thermos of coffee. Those were his kind of luxuries. He didn't need fancy vacations or crowds, just peace. He walked over to his favorite spot on the north side of the lake, where a large oak tree leaned out over the water. The roots made a perfect seat, and the shade lasted most of the morning. He set up his chair, opened his tackle box, and started preparing his line. The sound of a bird calling across the water echoed softly. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker was tapping away on a tree trunk. Every sound was calm and familiar. Daniel had grown up coming here with his grandfather. He could still remember being a little boy, trying to hold a fishing pole that was too big for him. His grandfather would laugh and say, "Don't rush the fish, Danny, the lake's got its own rhythm." Now, years later, those words still stayed in his mind. He felt closer to his grandfather whenever he was here. He cast his line and watched the small ripples spread out across the water. For a while, nothing happened, and that was fine with him. Fishing wasn't about catching something every time. It was about slowing down, letting time stretch out. After a while, he reached into his cooler for his coffee and took a sip. The warm drink and the cool air made a perfect match. He leaned back in his chair, watching the sunlight shift across the lake. A few ducks floated by in the distance, moving lazily. A turtle popped its head above the surface and disappeared again. Everything was just as it should be. That peace, though, didn't last long. It started with a distant sound, something like paddles hitting water. At first, Daniel didn't think much of it. The lake was private, yes, but sometimes a birdwatcher or a hiker would wander too close without realizing. Usually, a quick conversation would clear things up. The sound grew louder. He looked up and saw a bright red kayak coming around the bend of the shoreline. The person paddling was moving fast, the water splashing with each stroke. Even from a distance, Daniel could tell the person was staring straight at him. He sighed softly. He didn't like conflict, but it looked like he was about to have some. The kayak glided closer, and Daniel could now see that it was a woman, maybe in her 40s. She wore large sunglasses and a wide sun hat. The kayak looked brand new, the kind of thing you'd see in a catalog. She slowed down a few feet away from him and gave him a sharp look. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud and firm. "Do you realize this is private property?" Daniel blinked, a little surprised. "Yes, I do," he said politely. She frowned. "Then why are you here?" He tried to keep his tone friendly. "Because this lake belongs to me." The woman gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Oh, really? You own this lake?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am. My family's owned it for over 50 years. She stared at him for a second, then shook her head. "That's not possible. This is a public lake. I come here all the time. Everyone does." Daniel could feel the tension rising, but he stayed calm. "I'm not sure what you were told, but the lake is private. It's on my property. The public lake is about 3 miles west of here." The woman crossed her arms. "That's ridiculous. I've been coming here for years. You can't just claim to own it." He gave a small sigh. "I'm not claiming anything. I have the deed. It's all in the county records if you want to check," she scoffed. "You're just trying to scare people off so you can have it all to yourself." Daniel shook his head. "No, ma'am. I don't mind people enjoying the lake as long as they respect it and don't litter or damage anything. But it is private land." Her expression hardened. "You don't get to tell me what to do. I know my rights. You're the one trespassing here. For a moment, Daniel just looked at her, not quite believing what he was hearing. She was talking to him like he was the one in the wrong, on his own property. He tried to smile, though it didn't reach his eyes this time. "I think there's just a misunderstanding. Maybe we can clear it up," but she cut him off. "No misunderstanding. I'm calling the sheriff." She reached for her phone, clearly thinking she was making a point. Daniel stayed quiet. He didn't want to argue. He'd learned long ago that shouting never solved anything. He packed up his fishing rod slowly, placed it beside his chair, and said softly, "You can call whoever you need to. I'll be right here." The woman frowned again but didn't dial. Maybe she was expecting him to get scared and leave. When he didn't, she seemed to hesitate. "Do you even live around here?" she asked finally, her tone a bit softer but still defensive. "Yes," Daniel said. "About half a mile that way." He pointed through the trees. "My grandfather built a cabin there. I still live in it." She looked toward the trees but didn't say anything. He could tell she didn't believe him. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle lap of water against the kayak and the far-off call of a loon. Finally, she muttered, "We'll see about this," and started paddling away. Her strokes quick and jerky. Daniel watched her go. He didn't feel angry, just tired. Things like this had happened before, though not often. Sometimes people just didn't believe that something so peaceful could belong to one person. They assumed everything natural must be open for everyone. He didn't blame them for wanting to enjoy the beauty, but he wished they would at least listen before accusing him of something. He sat back down in his chair and stared at the ripples where her kayak had been. The water slowly calmed again, returning to that perfect stillness. He sipped his coffee, now a little cooler than before, and let out a long breath. The day wasn't ruined. Not yet. He'd deal with whatever came next when it came. He thought about his grandfather again, the way he used to laugh about life's little dramas. "People argue about land, but the land doesn't argue back," his grandfather once said. "It just waits for you to calm down." Daniel smiled quietly at the memory. Maybe he'd bring the paperwork next time, just in case. Not to show off, but to avoid another scene like this. The sun had climbed higher now, and the light sparkled across the water. The ducks had returned to their corner of the lake, unbothered by human disagreements. Somewhere across the water, the red kayak disappeared behind the trees. Daniel picked up his fishing pole again, checked his bait, and cast the line back into the lake. The sound of the reel spinning felt comforting. Whatever had just happened didn't matter anymore. This was still his place, his piece of the world. The fish didn't seem to mind the earlier noise either. The line tugged gently, and Daniel smiled as he began to reel it in. Life, he thought, had a funny way of reminding you what really mattered. And right now, all that mattered was the water, the quiet, and the feeling of being exactly where he belonged. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and the air outside the cabin was cool and quiet. He brewed himself a cup of coffee and sat by the small wooden table near the window, looking out at the trees. The memory of yesterday's encounter stayed fresh in his mind. The woman at the lake, he still didn't know her name, had left him uneasy. Not angry, but unsettled. He wasn't used to confrontation. He liked things calm and simple. But her tone, her words, the disbelief in her eyes, it had all stuck with him longer than he expected. He took a slow sip of coffee and sighed. Maybe it would just blow over, he thought. Maybe she'd gone home, looked up the records, and realized her mistake. Still, something told him it wasn't over. After breakfast, he packed up his truck again. Fishing wasn't just a hobby for him. It was a way of clearing his head. And after yesterday, he needed that more than ever. The dirt path to the lake was damp from the night's dew. His tires crunched softly over the stones as he drove. When he reached the clearing, the lake looked even more peaceful than before. The early morning light was soft pink, the kind of color that only lasted a few minutes before the sun took over. He smiled a little, grateful for the stillness. He grabbed his fishing gear, stepped out of the truck, and made his way to the same old oak tree. The birds were already awake, chirping in short bursts. The surface of the water glowed faintly. Everything seemed perfect again. Daniel set down his chair and cast his line. He sat quietly for a while, just listening to the soft sounds of nature. He felt the tension from yesterday start to fade. Maybe it really was over. But peace, it seemed, didn't last long around here anymore. About an hour later, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel, the kind of sound that didn't belong in such a quiet place. He turned his head and saw a shiny black SUV pulling into the clearing. Out stepped the same woman from yesterday. Her sunglasses were perched on top of her head this time, and she looked even more determined. Beside her was a man who looked like her husband, tall, graying at the temples, and clearly not in the mood for small talk. They walked straight toward Daniel. "Good morning," he said politely, hoping this wouldn't turn into another argument. The woman didn't bother with greetings. "We checked online," she said sharply. "It says this lake doesn't appear on public maps, so that means it's unlisted, which means it's not owned by anyone." Daniel blinked. "That's not how it works," he said carefully. Her husband crossed his arms. "She's right," he said. "I've lived in this county my whole life. Nobody owns this lake." Daniel took a deep breath. "Sir, I respect that you've lived here a long time, but my grandfather bought this land in the 70s. The lake came with it. I have the deed, the tax records, everything. It's private property." The woman rolled her eyes. "Anyone can say that." "I can show you the papers," Daniel offered gently. "They're in my truck." But before he could move, the man stepped forward slightly, not threatening but clearly irritated. "You're telling me we can't come here anymore? My wife's been kayaking here for years." Daniel nodded slowly. "You can still come if you ask first. I've never turned anyone away who's respectful. I just ask people not to assume it's public." The woman folded her arms tightly. "That's ridiculous. We're not asking permission to enjoy nature." "You don't own nature," he smiled faintly. "You're right. I don't own nature, but I do own this piece of land. I take care of it, clean it, and pay taxes on it. That's all." There was silence for a moment. The husband looked like he wanted to say something more, but the woman spoke first. "We'll see about that," she said coldly. "I'm going to talk to the county office." "I know people there," Daniel nodded. "That's fine. They'll tell you exactly what I'm telling you now." She glared at him for another moment, then turned and stomped back toward the SUV. Her husband followed, though he looked less sure of himself now. Daniel watched them go, feeling that same tired weight settle in his chest again. He didn't like this feeling. He didn't like that something so peaceful had turned into a debate. When the sound of their engine faded, he looked out across the lake again. The sun was higher now, glinting off the ripples, but the peace was gone. He reeled in his line and sat quietly for a while. He didn't even bother baiting the hook again. His thoughts were too loud. He remembered when his grandfather was alive how everyone in the area knew him. People respected him because he respected them. If anyone had a question about boundaries or land use, they'd just talk it out. No shouting, no accusations. Just conversation. Things had changed. Daniel wasn't angry at the woman. He understood in a way. People got used to certain places, especially beautiful ones. They came to feel like they belonged there even when they didn't. Still, the lack of respect bothered him. He'd always believed that kindness went a long way. He stayed by the lake until noon. No more interruptions came, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the situation wasn't over. When he finally packed up and headed home, the dirt road felt longer than usual. The trees seemed to close in on him, whispering with every gust of wind. At home, he opened the old wooden chest in his living room, the one his grandfather had kept important papers in. Inside were yellowed folders, maps, and the original property deed. Daniel laid them out on the table, reading through each page carefully. There it was, in black and white. The lake, the surrounding land, the coordinates, and his grandfather's signature. Everything was clear. Everything was legal. He smiled faintly, feeling both proud and sad. Proud because his grandfather had worked hard to buy this land. Sad because he knew not everyone saw that kind of effort anymore. He placed the documents in a clean folder and set them by the door. Next time he thought he'd bring them with him, not to prove anyone wrong, but to protect what his family had built. The next few days passed quietly. Daniel went about his usual routine, fixing small things around the cabin, checking his garden, and reading in the evenings. But the calm didn't last. 3 days later, as he was chopping wood in the backyard, he heard another vehicle coming down the path. He turned to see the same black SUV pulling up again. This time, the woman wasn't alone. A county official's car followed right behind her. Daniel wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over calmly. The woman stepped out, looking smug. "I told you," she said. "I brought someone who can settle this." The man from the county stepped forward, holding a clipboard. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "We received a complaint about possible access issues around the lake." Daniel nodded, keeping his voice calm. "Yes, I'm aware. Would you like to see the property documents?" The man blinked, surprised. "You have them?" Daniel turned, walked into his cabin, and returned with the folder. He handed it over without a word. The official flipped through the pages, scanning the details. After a few minutes, he looked up. "Everything checks out," he said simply. "The lake is private property. It's listed under your family name. Has been for decades." The woman's expression froze. "That can't be right," she said weakly. "I've been coming here for years." The man shrugged. "That doesn't change ownership, ma'am." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Her husband stood quietly behind her, looking embarrassed. Daniel just smiled gently. "Like I said before, you're welcome to come here if you ask first. I don't want to keep anyone from enjoying the place. I just want people to respect it." The official handed the documents back. "You're in the clear, sir. Sorry for the trouble." "Not at all," Daniel said kindly. "You're just doing your job." When the cars finally left, Daniel stood for a long moment in the quiet. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the last echo of their engines. He walked down to the lake again, watching the sunlight shimmer on the water. The same stillness returned, the kind that seemed to reach right into his chest. He smiled faintly. Maybe now, finally, things would go back to normal. He set his chair back under the oak tree, cast his line, and watched the ripples spread out. Somewhere across the water, a fish jumped, breaking the surface for just a second before disappearing again. The lake was peaceful again, just the way it was meant to be. The next weekend came faster than Daniel expected. He had spent the last few days keeping busy with chores around his cabin, fixing a few broken fence posts and trimming the path that led to the lake. He liked staying active. It kept his mind calm, but no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, his thoughts kept returning to what had happened. He wondered if the woman, he still didn't know her name, had told others about him. In a small community like theirs, stories spread faster than fire on dry grass. He could almost imagine the conversations happening in town. People saying there was some new guy claiming to own the lake. Except, of course, he wasn't new at all. He'd been here his whole life. That morning, Daniel decided to head to the lake again. He wanted to clear his head and remind himself why this place mattered so much. The sky was clear, the air warm but not too hot, and the smell of pine drifted through the forest. When he reached the clearing, he noticed something unusual right away. 2 cars were parked near the trees. Not his, not anyone he recognized. His stomach tightened a little. He got out of the truck slowly, locking the door behind him. By the time he reached the edge of the water, he could see them, 3 people standing near the lake. One of them was the same woman. The others looked like her friends. They had folding chairs, coolers, and even a small speaker playing soft music. Daniel paused for a moment, unsure of what to do. The last thing he wanted was another argument. But he also couldn't just pretend not to see them. He took a deep breath and walked down toward the water. "Morning," he said politely. The woman turned around and frowned. "Oh, it's you again," Daniel nodded. "Yes, it's me. I see you brought company." One of her friends, a younger man in sunglasses, gave him a half smile. "Yeah, we thought we'd spend the day out here." "Beautiful spot." Daniel tried to keep his voice calm. "It is beautiful. But this is private property, like I mentioned before." The woman folded her arms. "We talked to people at the coffee shop in town. They said nobody owns this lake. You're just trying to keep everyone else away." Daniel's patience wavered, but he still kept his tone gentle. "Ma'am, we already settled this with the county official. He came out here, checked the documents, and confirmed it's private. I have all the papers if you'd like to see them again." She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please. Papers can say anything. Just because someone wrote something down 50 years ago doesn't mean it's true now." The younger man laughed quietly. "Yeah, man, it's just a lake. Chill out." Daniel took another breath, reminding himself to stay calm. "It's not about being strict," he said softly. "I'm just asking for respect. This land has been in my family for generations. I take care of it, and I don't mind people visiting as long as they ask first." The woman's other friend, an older lady sitting in a folding chair, looked up at him with a curious expression. "You really live out here all by yourself?" she asked. Daniel nodded. Yes, ma'am. Been here most of my life. The older lady smiled faintly. Must be peaceful. It is, Daniel said, smiling back. That's why I try to keep it that way. The woman in charge, though, wasn't smiling. You know what's not peaceful? She said. People trying to gatekeep nature. You can't just tell people where they can and can't go. Daniel could feel his patience slipping. He didn't like being accused of things that weren't true. Still, he kept his voice steady. I'm not trying to keep anyone out of nature. I just don't want people treating this place like a public park. I clean it, maintain it, and protect the wildlife here. When people leave trash or make noise, it hurts the place. There was a short silence. The older lady looked away as if she understood what he meant. The younger man turned off the speaker without being asked. But the woman still stood her ground. You're being dramatic, she said. We're not hurting anything. Daniel looked at her cooler sitting half in the water, the edge leaking a bit of plastic wrap. Maybe not today, he said gently. But over time it adds up. Her expression hardened again. You just don't like seeing other people here. Admit it, he shook his head. That's not true. I actually like when people enjoy the place. I just wish they'd do it respectfully. She rolled her eyes, clearly done with the conversation. You're wasting your breath. We're staying. If you don't like it, call the police. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked out at the lake, the sunlight glinting off the water's surface, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly he replied, all right, if that's what it takes. He turned and started walking back toward his truck. Behind him, he heard the younger man laugh. Guess he gave up. But Daniel hadn't given up. He was tired of the constant back and forth. He didn't want to argue, but he wasn't going to let people treat his family's land like it didn't matter. He drove back to his cabin and went inside. The folder of property documents still sat on the kitchen counter. He picked it up, flipping through the pages once more. Everything was clear. The lake, the land, the boundaries, all legally his. He took out his phone and called the same county office that had sent someone before. When the clerk answered, Daniel explained what was happening. The man on the phone sighed. Same group again? I'm afraid so, Daniel said. They're down there right now. I'll send an officer to remind them, the clerk said. They'll have to leave once it's verified again. Thank you, Daniel said quietly. An hour later, a sheriff's car rolled down the dirt road toward the lake. Daniel followed in his truck, not wanting things to get out of hand. When they arrived, the group was still there, music back on, laughter echoing across the water. The officer, a calm middle-aged man, stepped out of his car and walked toward them. Morning, folks, he said politely. Mind if I see what's going on here? The woman turned around, clearly irritated. We're just relaxing. This man keeps saying we can't be here. The officer nodded. I see. And do you have permission from the owner? She frowned. There is no owner. The officer glanced at Daniel. Sir, do you have your documentation again? Daniel handed over the folder. The officer looked through it carefully, then turned back to the group. Everything checks out. This property belongs to him. I'm going to have to ask you all to pack up and leave. The woman stared at him like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. You're kidding. You're taking his side. The officer shrugged. It's not about sides, ma'am. It's about property law. This isn't a public lake. The younger man muttered something under his breath, but the older lady began folding her chair quietly. She looked up at Daniel and said softly, I'm sorry about all this. Daniel gave her a small nod. It's all right. The woman finally gathered her things, though her movements were sharp and angry. You won't stop people from coming here, she said coldly. This isn't over. Daniel didn't respond. He just watched as they left, their cars kicking up dust on the dirt road until the sound faded away completely. When they were gone, the officer turned to him. You handled that well, he said. Most people would have lost their temper. Daniel smiled faintly. I've learned that yelling doesn't help much. The officer nodded. You'd be surprised how often folks think public and private are the same thing. Happens a lot around lakes like this. I can imagine, Daniel said quietly. After the officer left, Daniel stood alone by the water. The afternoon sun shimmered across the lake, the same as it always had. He took a slow breath, feeling the tension slowly fade away. For a moment, he thought about what his grandfather would have said. Probably something simple like, you can't control people, but you can control how you treat them. Daniel smiled at the thought. Maybe that was what he needed to focus on. Not the frustration, but the patience it took to protect something worth keeping. He walked to the edge of the lake, crouched down, and dipped his hand in the water. It was cool and clear, just like when he was a boy. He watched the ripples move outward, blending into the reflection of the sky. The place was quiet again, peaceful again, and this time Daniel hoped it would stay that way. He picked up his fishing rod, found his favorite spot under the oak tree, and cast his line once more. As he leaned back in his chair, the world around him settled into silence. The wind whispered through the leaves, and somewhere across the lake, a heron lifted off into the sky. Daniel smiled softly to himself. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for sure. This place wasn't just land. It was memory, history, and peace, and no argument could ever take that away from him. A few weeks had passed since that last confrontation at the lake. For the first time in a while, things had gone quiet again. No cars on the dirt road, no uninvited guests setting up chairs, and no angry voices echoing across the water. Daniel almost couldn't believe it. The silence felt too good to be true. Every morning, he'd step out onto his porch, sip his coffee, and listen to the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves. The peace he had been missing was slowly coming back, but even with that calm, part of him couldn't help wondering if the woman and her friends would show up again. He wasn't afraid of them. He had handled the situation well before, but he didn't like conflict. He didn't want his quiet life turning into a constant argument about land and ownership. One Saturday morning, Daniel decided to do something he hadn't done in years. Instead of fishing or fixing things, he wanted to take a walk around the far side of the lake. There was an old trail that circled halfway around before fading into thick woods. He remembered walking it as a boy with his grandfather, listening to stories about how they built the first small dock and how his grandfather had worked for months to clear the brush by hand. The path was still there, a little overgrown but easy enough to follow. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Birds darted between the trees and the sunlight flickered through the branches. Daniel felt a quiet joy moving through that familiar space. Each step brought back memories, his grandfather laughing, his father teaching him to skip stones. Long summer evenings spent watching fireflies over the water. After a while, he reached the far side of the lake and noticed something unexpected. A small pile of trash sat near the edge of the water. Plastic bottles, snack wrappers, and an old towel half buried in the mud. He sighed softly. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. He had worked hard to keep this place clean, and seeing it treated carelessly always hurt. Daniel crouched down, gathered the trash into a bag he carried for just this kind of thing, and tied it up. Then he noticed something else, a kayak paddle leaning against a rock. He looked around, but no one was there. The water was calm, no sign of movement across the surface. He picked up the paddle and recognized it immediately. It had the same red stripe as the kayak the woman used before. For a moment, he debated what to do. Maybe she'd come back without him noticing. Maybe she'd lost it weeks ago. Either way, it was clear she had been there again. He carried the paddle back to his truck and leaned it against the side. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something told him this wasn't the end of things. 2 days later, while Daniel was tending to his small vegetable garden behind the cabin, he heard a car coming down the path again. The sound made his stomach tighten. He stood up, brushed off his hands, and waited. The same black SUV rolled to a stop. But this time, when the woman stepped out, she looked different. Her posture wasn't stiff or angry. Her face didn't carry that same sharp look it had before. She actually looked nervous. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He just waited as she walked closer. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hello," Daniel replied, his voice even. She looked around awkwardly, then pointed to the paddle leaning against the truck. "That's mine," she said. "I left it there last week. I was hoping I could come by and pick it up." Daniel nodded. "I figured it might be. I found it on the far side of the lake." She hesitated for a second, then said, "Thank you for keeping it safe." He handed it to her. "No problem." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt heavy but not angry, just quiet and unsure. Finally, she let out a small sigh. "Look," she said, "I wanted to apologize." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. He hadn't expected that. She continued, "I shouldn't have yelled at you or brought other people here. I didn't know the whole story, and I didn't want to believe it when you told me. I thought you were just being selfish. But after the sheriff came and explained everything, I looked up the records myself. You were right, Daniel nodded slowly. I appreciate you saying that. She gave a small, embarrassed laugh. I guess I let my pride get in the way. I grew up coming here as a kid with my dad. We used to fish by the east side of the lake. I didn't realize it was private land then, it just felt like part of home, you know? Daniel's expression softened. I understand that, he said. I grew up here too. My grandfather bought this land when I was little. He always said the lake should be cared for, not claimed. That's all I've ever tried to do. The woman nodded. I can see that now, I just didn't want to lose something that felt familiar. Daniel smiled gently. Sometimes we think something belongs to us just because we love it. But love doesn't always mean ownership. She looked down at the ground, thoughtful. You're right. They stood in silence for a few moments. The sound of birds filled the air again. The awkwardness started to fade. Then she said, If you don't mind, I'd like to make it up to you somehow. Maybe help clean up around the lake. I've seen some litter there too. I could come by with a few friends, people who actually respect the place this time. Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking. That would be nice, he said finally. It's a lot for one person to handle. Her face brightened a little. All right, I'll bring some bags and gloves this weekend if that's okay. That's fine, he said. I appreciate it, she smiled genuinely this time. Thank you for being patient with me. Daniel nodded. Thank you for coming back and talking about it. She took her paddle, gave a small wave, and headed back to her car. As she drove away, Daniel felt a strange mix of relief and surprise. He hadn't expected her to apologize, let alone offer to help. That weekend, she came back as promised. This time she arrived in a smaller car, dressed in old jeans and a baseball cap. She brought trash bags, gloves, and even a rake. Daniel met her by the shore, and they spent the morning picking up bits of debris that had washed up near the edges. They didn't talk much at first, just worked quietly side by side. But as the hours passed, the conversation started to flow naturally. She told him about her family, about how her father used to take her camping by the lake when she was a child. He shared stories about his grandfather, the man who had taught him to respect the land. By noon, they had filled several bags with trash. They sat by the water, eating sandwiches and drinking bottled water she had brought. The mood was light, almost peaceful. There was no tension now, only understanding. You know, she said with a small laugh, I never thought I'd end up cleaning a lake I once argued about. Daniel chuckled. Life's funny that way. She nodded, looking out at the water. I'm glad I came back, though. I can see why you care so much about this place. It's special. Daniel followed her gaze. The lake shimmered under the sunlight, calm and endless. It is, he said softly, and it's even better when people respect it. They spent the rest of the day finishing the cleanup, talking about simple things, gardening, fishing, and life away from noise and crowds. By the time the sun began to set, the lake looked cleaner than it had in months. Before she left, she turned to him and said, If it's all right, I'd like to keep helping sometimes. Maybe organize a small group of locals who care about the lake too. With your permission, of course. Daniel smiled warmly. That sounds good to me. Just make sure they ask first, she grinned. You have my word. When she drove away that evening, the sky was painted in orange and gold. Daniel stood by the water, watching the reflection of the sunset ripple across the lake's surface. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace, not just because the conflict was over, but because something good had come out of it. He realized that sometimes understanding grows from conflict. People change and hearts soften when they're given the chance. That night, Daniel sat on his porch listening to the soft sounds of the forest. The lake was quiet again, the air cool and calm. He smiled to himself. The place hadn't just stayed his, it had become something more. A shared space built on respect, patience, and kindness, and somehow that felt better than owning it at all. Months had passed since the morning when Daniel and the woman cleaned the lake together. The air had grown cooler now, the trees around the water turning shades of orange, red, and gold. Autumn had arrived quietly, painting the land in warm colors and soft breezes. Daniel stood on his porch one afternoon, holding a mug of coffee and watching the sunlight dance across the ripples of the lake. It had been a long time since he'd seen the place look so peaceful. and not just peaceful but cared for. Since that first day they worked together, she had returned several times. Not in a rush, not uninvited, but with a message first asking if it was all right. She brought a few friends on some weekends, all of them respectful and calm, helping to clean the edges of the water, trim back some overgrown bushes, and collect litter left behind by passing hikers. Daniel had never asked for help, but he couldn't deny how much it warmed his heart to see people treating the place with love instead of claiming it. The small group slowly became a familiar sight. They'd sometimes bring snacks and sit on blankets by the shore after cleaning. Daniel didn't always join them, but he liked hearing their laughter echo across the lake. It reminded him of his family from long ago, his father, his grandfather, those quiet afternoons of fishing and stories by the fire. One Saturday, Daniel decided to go down to the dock early in the morning. Mist floated above the water and the world felt soft and quiet. He dropped his fishing line into the lake and sat back on the wooden boards, his thoughts wandering. He thought about how quickly things had changed. What once began as anger and misunderstanding had turned into something unexpectedly good. The woman who once yelled at him across the lake had become someone he could talk to like an old neighbor. She'd even brought her teenage son once, teaching him how to fish, while Daniel showed them the best spots near the shallows. It was strange how life worked sometimes. Conflict had led to understanding, and misunderstanding had opened the door to friendship. As Daniel sat there thinking, he heard footsteps behind him on the path. When he turned, he saw her again, holding a thermos in one hand and a small basket in the other. "Good morning," she said with a smile. "Morning," Daniel replied, setting his fishing rod aside. "I brought some muffins," she said, holding up the basket. "Blueberry. Thought you might want one." Daniel smiled. "That's mighty kind of you." She sat beside him on the dock, pouring 2 cups of coffee from the thermos. Steam rose into the cool air as they sat quietly, watching the mist lift off the water. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Every time I come back, I see something new." Daniel nodded. "That's how it's always been. The lake changes with the light. My grandfather used to say it had moods, some days calm, some days restless." She smiled. "I like that." For a while they didn't talk much. They just watched the water. The calm between them didn't need to be filled with words anymore. After a few minutes, she turned slightly toward him and said, "You know, I've been thinking about what you said before, that love doesn't always mean ownership. I've been trying to teach that to my son. He used to think everything we liked belonged to us somehow, but after spending time here, he understands better. He even started helping clean the park near our house." Daniel chuckled quietly. "That's good to hear. The world needs more people who take care of things they love, not just use them." She nodded, then paused. "You know, we've been thinking about setting up a small community cleanup day here every few months. Nothing big, just people who care about nature. We'd love to do it with your permission, of course." Daniel looked out over the lake again, the sunlight glinting off the surface. "That sounds like a fine idea," he said. "As long as everyone respects the land, I don't mind. The more care it gets, the longer it'll stay beautiful." Her face lit up. "Thank you. I promise we'll keep it peaceful." Daniel smiled. "That's all I ask." The day went by quietly. They spent the morning walking around the lake, checking the trails and making plans for small improvements. They talked about adding a few benches near the water and putting up small signs reminding visitors to clean up after themselves. Nothing fancy, just gentle reminders of respect. Over the next few months, things continued that way. The small cleanup gatherings grew into something special. Families came with their kids, people brought homemade food, and everyone worked together, laughing and talking like they'd known each other for years. Daniel watched it all unfold with quiet pride. He never asked to be the center of it, but somehow, everyone saw him that way. The quiet man who cared enough to protect a piece of land that brought people together. He'd often stand by the old oak tree on the hill, watching as people picked up litter, skipped stones, or shared sandwiches near the dock. It wasn't loud or wild. It was calm, respectful, and full of life. One afternoon, as the cleanup wrapped up, a small group gathered around Daniel. The woman stepped forward, holding a framed picture of the lake with a note inside. "We wanted to thank you," she said, smiling warmly, "for sharing this place with us, and for teaching us that caring means more than owning." Daniel took the frame carefully, reading the note. It said, "For the man who taught us to see beauty not as a right but as a gift." He looked up, touched and quiet. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly. "We wanted to," she replied. "You could have kept this place to yourself. But instead you shared it, and that changed more than you know." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He smiled, his eyes glistening just a bit. "Well," he said, his voice gentle, "I guess my grandfather would be proud to see this. He always said this lake had a way of bringing good people together." The woman smiled. He was right. The group stayed a little longer that day, talking and laughing as the sun dipped lower. When the last car drove away and the sound of voices faded, Daniel stood alone by the water once more. The evening breeze carried the faint smell of pine and earth. The reflection of the setting sun shimmered across the calm lake, turning everything golden. He thought about how much had changed. Not long ago, this same place had been filled with shouting and anger. Now it was filled with laughter and kindness. The lake hadn't just stayed his. It had become everyone's in spirit, though still cared for under his name. Daniel smiled to himself. He realized that sometimes the best kind of ownership wasn't about holding something tightly. It was about sharing it with the right people. He turned back toward the cabin, the framed picture tucked under his arm. Before stepping inside, he looked over his shoulder once more at the lake. The surface was smooth, reflecting the sky like glass. In that quiet moment, Daniel felt complete peace. He wasn't just the owner of the land anymore. He was the keeper of something that brought people joy, comfort, and connection. Weeks later, he received a letter in the mail. It was from the town council. Inside was a note thanking him for supporting local cleanup efforts and helping foster community involvement in environmental care. They mentioned the lake by name and even added it to their list of community preservation sites. Daniel laughed softly when he read it. He didn't need any recognition, but it felt good to know the lake's story had reached others. He placed the letter beside the framed picture on a shelf by the window. Every morning after that, when the sun rose over the water, its light would catch the frame and cast a soft glow across the room. One morning, as he sat sipping coffee, he noticed the woman and her son walking down to the dock. They waved, and he waved back. The boy held a fishing rod, and Daniel smiled. "Looks like he's learning fast," Daniel called out. "He's trying." She laughed. "You started something good here." Daniel nodded, his heart warm. "We all did." The boy cast his line into the water, and the sound of laughter floated across the lake. Daniel leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The breeze moved through the trees, gentle and steady, carrying the sound of life, soft, honest, and peaceful. And as he listened, he thought about everything that had happened: the argument, the misunderstanding, the apology, and finally, the friendship that grew from it all. He realized something important. Sometimes people aren't meant to be pushed away, even when they start as trouble. Sometimes they just need to be shown a better way to belong. The lake had taught them all that lesson, and in return, it had given Daniel more than he ever expected. A reminder that kindness, patience, and understanding could turn even the most difficult encounters into something beautiful. The sun sank lower, the light soft and golden across the water. The sound of a reel spinning echoed through the quiet, followed by laughter. Daniel smiled again. The lake was alive with peace, and this time it wasn't just his, it was theirs.